Contemporary philosophical realism is the belief that some aspect of our reality is ontologically independent of our conceptual schemes, perceptions, linguistic practices, beliefs, etc. Realism may be spoken of with respect to other minds, the past, the future, universals, mathematical entities, moral categories, the material world, and thought. Realism can also be promoted in an unqualified sense, in which case, it asserts the mind-independent existence of a visible world, as opposed to skepticism and solipsism. Philosophers who profess realism state that truth consists in the mind's correspondence to reality. Realists tend to believe that whatever we believe now is only an approximation of reality, and that every new observation brings us closer to understanding reality. In its Kantian sense, realism is contrasted with idealism. In a contemporary sense, realism is contrasted with anti-realism, primarily in the philosophy of science. History. The oldest use of the term realism appears in medieval scholastic interpretations and adaptations of Greek philosophy. Here, however, it is a Platonic realism developed out of debates over the problem of universals. Universals are terms or properties that can be applied to many things, such as red, beauty, 5, or dog. Realism in this context, contrasted with conceptualism and nominalism, holds that such universals really exist, independently and somehow prior to the world. Moderate realism holds that they exist, but only insofar as they are instantiated in specific things, they do not exist separately from the specific thing. Conceptualism holds that they exist, but only in the mind, while nominalism holds that universals do not exist at all but are no more than words that describe specific objects. Platonic realism. Platonic realism is a philosophical term usually used to refer to the idea of realism regarding the existence of universals or abstract objects after the Greek philosopher Plato, a student of Socrates. As universals were considered by Plato to be ideal forms, this stance is confusingly also called Platonic Idealism. This should not be confused with idealism, as presented by philosophers such as George Berkeley. As Platonic abstractions are not spatial, temporal, or mental, they are not compatible with the latter idealism's emphasis on mental existence. Plato's forms include numbers and geometrical figures, making them a theory of mathematical realism. They also include the form of the good, making them in addition a theory of ethical realism. The Scottish school of common sense realism. Scottish common sense realism is a school of philosophy that sought to defend naive realism against philosophical paradox and skepticism, arguing that matters of common sense are within the reach of common understanding and that common sense beliefs even govern the lives and thoughts of those who hold non-commonsensical beliefs. It originated in the ideas of the most prominent members of the Scottish School of Common Sense, Thomas Reid, Adam Ferguson and Dugald Stewart. During the 18th century, Scottish Enlightenment and flourished in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Scotland and America. Its roots can be found in responses to such philosophers as John Locke, George Berkeley and David Hume. The approach was a response to the ideal system that began with Descartes' concept of the limitations of sense experience and led Locke and Hume to a skepticism that called religion and the evidence of the senses equally into question. The common-sense realists found skepticism to be absurd and so contrary to common experience that it had to be rejected. They taught that ordinary experiences provide intuitively certain assurance of the existence of the self, of real objects that could be seen and felt, and of certain first principles, upon which sound morality and religious beliefs could be established. Its basic principle was enunciated by its founder and greatest figure, Thomas Reid. If there are certain principles, as I think there are, which the constitution of our nature leads us to believe, and which we are under a necessity to take for granted in the common concerns of life, without being able to give a reason for them. These are what we call the principles of common sense, and what is manifestly contrary to them is what we call absurd, naive realism. Naive realism, also known as direct realism, is the philosophy of mind rooted in a common-sense theory of perception that claims that the senses provide us with direct awareness of the external world. In contrast, some forms of idealism assert that no world exists apart from mind-dependent ideas, and some forms of skepticism say we cannot trust our senses. The realist view is that objects are composed of matter, occupy space, and have properties, such as size, shape, texture, smell, taste and color, that are usually perceived correctly. We perceive them as they really are. Objects obey the laws of physics and retain all their properties whether or not there is anyone to observe them. Scientific realism. Scientific realism is, at the most general level, the view that the world described by science is the real world, as it is, independent of what we might take it to be. Within philosophy of science, it is often framed as an answer to the question, how is the success of science to be explained? The debate over what the success of science involves centers primarily on the status of unobservable entities apparently talked about by scientific theories. Generally, those who are scientific realists assert that one can make reliable claims about unobservables as observables. Analytical philosophers generally have a commitment to scientific realism, in the sense of regarding the scientific method as a reliable guide to the nature of reality. The main alternative to scientific realism is instrumentalism. Aesthetic realism. Aesthetic realism may mean the claim that there are mind-independent aesthetic facts, but in general discussions about art, realism is a complex term that may have a number of different meanings.